the CBD, of course, has its origins in the UN Conference on Environment and Development, which was held in 1992 in Rio. It's also known as the Earth Summit or the Rio Summit, right? And at that inaugural meeting, there was actually agreement at the heads of states levels on the UN Declaration on Environment and Development, which is actually what we call the Rio Principles, right? And part of these Rio Principles include, the principle of precaution, the precautionary principle, as well as the polluter pays principle. Now, these basically say that, in essence, that we need to be able to assess, to ensure that whatever interventions we're doing in the environment is adequately looked at, assessed, and with the principle of precaution in place, basically, which is about being, better safe than sorry. So to have a precautionary approach, as well as the polluter pays principle, is a lot about who's responsible and whose responsibility is it when things go wrong. So the issue of liability and redress, for example. And in the CBD itself, which is really a universal environmental agreement that is signed and agreed on by all countries in the world, with the exception of the United States, is really the premier environmental agreement that looks at biodiversity conservation and sustainable use, and the fair and equitable sharing of the benefits arising from the utilization of genetic resources. And the CBD itself, in its own provisions, has provisions for identification and monitoring. That's really essentially a horizon scanning function, because parties to the CBD are obliged to identify potential threats and to monitor them. And that's really what horizon scanning is about. Secondly, there are provisions in the CBD as well that deal with assessing impacts and minimizing adverse impacts. When we talk about the issue of biosafety and genetically modified organisms or living modified organisms, for example, the Cartagena Protocol is really an embodiment or an expression of this technology assessment. Risk assessment is central to the Cartagena Protocol, and parties are also have the right to take socioeconomic considerations into account when it comes to assessing the impacts of LMOs and making decisions about them. So we actually do see in this body of legal treaties, and these are legally binding agreements, we do see in these bodies of these treaties, the provisions are there already to ask parties to do these tasks so as to minimize the risk to environment and also taking into account risks to human health. Currently, in the current discussions, and there are discussions ongoing on synthetic biology under the CBD, and there are more specific discussions going on with regard to the risk assessment of LMOs containing engineered gene drives or gene drive organisms. So these are all up for discussion now. And in the synthetic biology discussions, a main issue is, the operationalizing or establishing a broad and regular horizon scanning assessment and monitoring process. Now, parties to the CBD already agreed that such a process is necessary. They did that in 2018 when the parties last met, obviously before the pandemic. Excuse me. And they agreed that such a process is necessary. Now it's about really operationalizing it and putting it into place. So this is a key discussion that will be upcoming in the COP to come later this year. This is currently being discussed by parties to the Cartagena Protocol on biosafety. And of course, it would be important to provide some guidance on this issue. Of course, bearing in mind, a precautionary approach and ensuring that even, especially with gene-drive organisms, where there are situations where it's not possible to do the risk assessment, or we don't have enough information to be able to assess the risk adequately, then we must have some sort of cut-off criteria or some sort of means to say, hang on, we can't do this, there's not enough information, and therefore, in accordance with the precautionary principle, we can't approve these sorts of applications. So I think that is the challenge ahead for this group that's discussing the guidance on risk assessment. Additionally, under the CBD, there are currently discussions ongoing to develop a global biodiversity framework. Now, this is supposed to set the international community's goals and priorities and targets for biodiversity, conservation, sustainable use, and fair and equitable benefit sharing. For the treaty, basically the implementation of the CBD over the next 8 years until 2030. And under those discussions, there is a specific target on biosafety. Right now, it's open as to whether this is only referring to LMOs, or is it referring to all products of biotechnology, or is it referring or inclusive of the new genetic engineering products such as gene-edited organisms and gene-drive organisms. But under those discussions as well, some parties have put forward proposals of the issue of technology horizon scanning, monitoring and assessment. So those things are on the table, but still to be negotiated. And I think that's absolutely critical for the functions of the CBD, because as we have these new technologies being rolled out and coming close to commercialization or even commercialized, and we know that there could be very potential large impacts on not only on the environment but also on human health as well as on socioeconomic conditions, then we really need to have a robust mechanism within the CBD to do this assessment and horizon scanning and monitoring. Horizon scanning so that you can anticipate potential impacts that are coming based on the research pipeline, for example. Monitoring, obviously, to continue looking at what are the impacts and being able to react and risk manage. And of course, the assessment part itself, which technology assessment, which is broader than risk assessment and also includes issues like socioeconomic considerations, ethical, cultural circumstances, for example. So these are very important discussions that are ongoing at the CBD at the moment. Gene-drive organisms, when you look at them fundamentally, they are genetically engineered organisms, or LMOs as they're called under the Cartagena Protocol. And there are procedures in place for risk assessment, for example. But discussions over the last few years have come to the realization that there is a need to adapt our risk assessment methodologies because gene-drive organisms are while genetically modified organisms, they pose much greater risks, and they also have conceptually different. Because if, for example, when we look at the purpose of a gene-drive organism, its purpose is to spread in the environment. Its purpose is to actually be in the environment in the wild, you could say, and to spread its trait to other members of the population. Whereas when we looked at traditional, what I can call traditional GMOs, I don't know, sorry, let me call them a better name, first generation genetically modified organisms. They are released in sort of semi-managed agricultural systems largely, and the whole idea and part of the risk assessment is to mitigate gene flow, is to stop the spread of these LMOs. So we have a very different conceptual framings for these types of organisms. And of course, with gene-drive organisms, you have much more potential for transboundary movement, unintentional transboundary movement particularly, because when you release it in one place, they're not bounded by national borders, but depend on the population of organisms, the targeted organisms, right? So if they occur in different national jurisdictions, there's nothing to stop the gene-drive machinery from spreading within that population. So then that makes the regulation also a bit more difficult because, much of the regulation that we have to deal with biosafety is based very much on national jurisdiction and bilateral arrangements. So here now we need a more multilateral arrangement that is able to, to see how do we do things like seek prior informed consent, for example, which is a key tenet that's operationalized through the Cartagena Protocol on biosafety. So these are just some of the challenges. I think these are not fully arranged. These kind of arrangements and discussions actually specific to gene-drive organisms haven't yet been had. There is a supplementary protocol to the Cartagena Protocol called the Nagoya's Kuala Lumpur Supplementary Protocol on Liability and Redress. And this is very much focused on response measures by national competent authorities to take if there are incidences of damage. And discussions on, for example, civil liability are not fully complete yet. So these are things that are still, I think, at a very nascent stage. Of course, at the national levels, countries may have national laws to deal with this, but because having the very nature of gene-drive organisms being transboundary, then we do therefore need a multilateral response as well that's able to deal with this beyond national jurisdictions as well. When we look at, for example, risk assessment, this often has been construed as very narrow and based on science, right, and scientific expertise. But of course, even within the Cartagena Protocol, in its provisions of risk assessment and the related annex, there is recognition of other knowledge and other expertise, so not just scientific. And I think that's important. And within the CBD, you have a very strong tradition of, acknowledgement of the role that Indigenous peoples and local communities play, for example, of the traditional knowledge they hold, that is relevant also, and these are relevant for assessing impacts. Current discussions under the synthetic biology agenda is really about having a group of experts that is multidisciplinary, that will conduct technology assessment that is broader than risk assessment, that takes into account socioeconomic considerations, ethical and cultural considerations as well. And I think this is important because, as you said, the potential implications and impacts of gene-drive organisms are very far-reaching. So it's not something that can only solely be decided by scientists. But we do need greater inclusivity, participation and consultation with Indigenous peoples and local communities. And the CBD has also recognized that the issue of free, prior, informed consent when it comes to gene-drive organisms is very important. So that's another key issue that has to be addressed. Yeah. With any technology, the questions we ask and the problems that we identify are actually very important, right? Sometimes we may not be asking the right questions even. When it comes to the gene-drive mosquitoes, for example, the target malaria case, there are already questions with regard to, the efficacy of whether it's even possible for them to develop these mosquitoes. They've got lots of technical issues to overcome in the first place. But of course, then if you come to releasing it in communities, then really the prior informed consent, the free, prior and informed consent of these communities is important. And this isn't just about one-sided delivery of information from a project proponent, for example, but it's really about engaging and understanding what the key issues are for these communities. And the question, of course, with malaria, absolutely, it's critical, especially for sub-Saharan Africa. It's a scourge on these countries, and in this day and age, we actually have the tools to be able to deal with this. And it's really, I think, a question of poverty, right, and access, because countries or peoples who can afford it are able to afford the treatments, because we have antivirals that can deal with it, and there's lots of other primary healthcare issues. Access to primary healthcare is really important. Sanitation, those sorts of issues are really important to discuss as well. So I think a lot of it is really about how we frame the problems, and then how do we see the solutions for these problems. And we need to ask the right questions. And I guess part of technology assessment is also about this, to identify, what is the problem that we're trying to find a solution for. Is this technology robust and fit for purpose, really? And it's not just about assessing one technology, but assessing a range of technologies to solve a problem. So in this case, then you have a broader discussion about, are there alternatives? Are there other alternatives that are available to address this problem, for example? And that's important. And I think this whole idea of technology assessment and broadening up both upstream and downstream is very important, because then we are asking bigger questions, and secondly, we are also consulting and involving and getting the participation of the communities who are going to be affected by these interventions.